Okay, in this session, we're going to move on from what were probably some down points of yesterday's discussion. I think we ended on a note that was suggesting that that EMI was very difficult, there were very many problems, and this morning I hope we're going to start to move to looking at how we can resolve some of those problems. Because just saying that there are problems is not nearly enough. As we said yesterday, the train has departed the station. We need to make sure it arrives safely. So today we have a number of presentations. We have 3 presentations of about 10 minutes each, and I've been told to be very vicious about timing for these things. And I'll allow the presenters to introduce themselves as they come here to the podium. To start, I'd just like to make a few observations, and these are essentially issues that have come up so far in the discussion. So, Yulia, could I have the presentation, please? Okay. Now, one of the things that I think is really important, and we must make sure it doesn't get lost in our discussions, are that English, in whatever model we have, and as we were saying yesterday, there's more than one possible model, has to have some sort of relationship to bilingual professional capacities. The aim of EMI is to add a language to the repertoire of learners. It's not to replace their repertoire with something else. And that we need to be thinking very much about the communicative dimension of what's coming out of this. EMI learners, any English language learners, need to be able to communicate about content in their first language and in other local languages if they're going to work effectively in the local field. This actually means we need to be thinking of 2 things in any English program. We need to be developing communicative English and academic English. Very few people exist just with the academic language capability. They need the communicative capability as well. Sometimes, and for some languages, it's not necessary. I did Latin at university, among other things. I don't have very strong communicative Latin, but I have managed to get by without needing to chat to people in Latin. Most languages are not like that, though. Most languages have people attached to them, and you do need to engage with the people. What we actually need to be focusing on then is how EMI pedagogy, how the curriculum, and how assessment, which all go very closely together, work together to achieve the goal of learning content in and through English. That's, I think, something that came up very strongly. We also need to focus on the fact that the purpose of EMI is not simply to learn content through English, but also to learn English through content. So we actually have this dual thing happening where each is supposed to support the other. And how do we do that, particularly in contexts where the content teacher is not a language teacher and the language teacher is not a content teacher? And I don't think they should be. They each have different skill sets, they have different knowledges and focuses, but how do we develop something where the English teacher and the content teacher work together to achieve something? I think that issue came out very strongly. And then, how do you express content? And expressing content is really different from knowing content. It's very easy to sort of produce something on a multiple choice exam that is right, but how do you express it in other ways? How do you communicate these ideas to others? And also, where does EMI fit in the whole development of the students' linguistic repertoire? Their first language, the official languages of the countries they live in, if that's not their first language, other languages that they might need regionally for communication, and so on. It's part of a repertoire. And how does that repertoire work? How does it get developed? How do we make sure that the bits and pieces of the repertoire don't get lost? Okay. So this means that there are big issues for implementation. And I think this is where we're starting to get at with this morning's discussion and in other things we're talking about today. And in thinking about implementation, I think there are a number of questions we need to be addressing. First of these is, how does general communicative language ability become relevant to and get developed by content learning? What's the fit between these things? There's also the need to think about the relationship between communicative language use and academic use, and how and where is each developed. I don't think the maths class is the best place to develop social language use, but there are aspects of social language use that need to be used in a maths class. So where are the students learning these aspects of their repertoire? And then how do we maximize learning? Because a good AMI program is one that has the maximum possible learning in the time available. And it's a really big issue because in EMI contexts, we've often got contexts where teachers are less able to teach in the L2 than they would be in the L1. Okay. So it's like there is a break on teachers' abilities when they move into a classroom and have to express themselves in a language they don't control as well as another language. And then you've got the students who may be less able to learn in an EMI context independently of the teacher because their language is limited. Teaching somebody with B1 language is not the same as teaching somebody with C2 language. What they can access in a classroom is different. And that means we need different pedagogies to deal with those. But we also need to realize that if we're involving students in learning two things at once, language and content, how are they enabled to use the strategies for language learning to learn mathematics and the strategies for maths learning to learn English? How do we maximize their strategic approach to learning? They may be very good learners of maths, maybe very good learners of English, but how do we make them very good learners of maths in English, which is not necessarily the same thing. And then there's the fact that it's much more demanding to learn material in a second language. And the issue becomes, is that demand worth the reward? Okay. Those of us who in policy terms would say, yes, we must have EMI, would say, yes, the demand is worth the rewards, but do students see that what they're getting is actually worth the effort that they're putting in? Or would it be more valuable to do one thing without the other? Can we move to, I've got the controller. So, what sorts of things do we need to be thinking about? We need to be thinking about professional learning for teaching staff, that is, developing their linguistic capabilities, and I would say those who are in communication, in subject knowledge, and in pedagogical practice. That these things are both, or three, linguistic. We also need to be developing their pedagogical practice. Just developing language is not enough. It's the pedagogical practice that is actually at the heart of this sort of innovation. And particularly in developing the pedagogies for teaching content to people who don't necessarily have the language abilities to access the content easily. And that's the really big challenge, I think, for the EMI teacher. Along with that, we can't just say that the teacher is responsible. We need to look at materials. Now, obviously, we can't develop materials in all languages for EMI. How are we going to use the materials that we've got in useful, effective ways? And how do we develop the supports and so on? And how do we develop learning assessment approaches that capture the goals of both language and content? Okay. If you have to write an essay in English and your English is not so good, does your English get in the way of expressing your content? And quite often it does. Sometimes it doesn't. But how do we separate that out? How do we know when our assessment is assessing content rather than language, and valuing the content rather than its expression? Or if we're assessing language rather than content and working out what's going to be valued where. So to shape the discussion for this part of the morning, I think there are a number of questions we should look at. We'll come back to these questions after the presentations, but I think there are a whole number of issues around implementation that we need to be asking ourselves in terms of both how we support academics to be good teachers and also how we best support students to be good learners. Having done that, I will pass over to my fellow panelists who will present some of the issues in the discussions in their countries as they try to move towards developing new practice.